I'll go ahead and start. This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay.
So,
Great.
all right. So now we can all be stalkers. So, so I'll do a super fast introduction. Ian, how do you pronounce your last name, Ian?
It's Neligh.
Neligh. Okay, I was guessing this whole time. So we have Ian Neligh with us today, and he is the author of a number of things, but most recently Spurred West, Rogues, Treasure Seekers, Bounty Hunters, and Colorful Characters Past and Present, which is an absolutely delightful read, very engaging. So I highly encourage people to give this a read. It is available from the public library as well as local bookstores. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Mr. Neligh to give himself a bit of an introduction, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so as you were saying, I wrote Spurred West. It's the second book that I wrote. It's funny because the inspiration for it came about because I had written another book called Gold, Madness, Murder, and Mayhem in the Colorado Rockies. And as part of that, I sort of got the chance to travel the Colorado area, which is where I'm from, and talk to gold miners, modern day prospectors and treasure hunters, and compare them sort of to the historical origins of the gold rush here in Colorado. And I was kind of blown away that people were still doing that. And I thought, gosh, I wonder if that kind of extends sort of more broadly to the Wild West, because definitely prospecting and looking for gold is wild, and there's other folks out there that do things like that. So I started looking around. Like many kids that grew up in the West, I was inspired by stories of like Billy the Kid, Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, folks like that. And so that was always kind of in the back of my mind, that there was these sort of legendary characters that had moved around through the West. And it really wasn't that long ago that these guys were operating and living and sort of breathing in some of the same areas that we're in today. And I kind of started wondering more broadly if the West today could be as wild as it was back then. So I spent a year sort of hunting down these folks that I thought kind of best represented the modern day Wild West. I interviewed treasure hunters and boxers, bare knuckle boxers. I interviewed bounty hunters, modern day gunslingers, U.S. Marshals, bullfighters, brand inspectors, the folks that look for cattle rustlers, and on and on and on, and trying to get a sense like, is the West still wild? And what does that mean? And then comparing it to the original Wild West, and kind of cutting through the mythology of it, finding out what parts of the Wild West were real and really had happened. Because we know that the Old West is an actual time period that sort of ended or began at the end of the Civil War and went up to about the 1900s. So that is the time of the Old West. The Wild West is something that's a little bit more, it's a little harder to pin down because parts of it were real and some parts weren't. One great way to look at that and kind of how I began the book and ended it was with the story of Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody was obviously a real person, and he was a scout and a buffalo hunter, and he had a very exciting, very thrilling life that he lived on the plains. But he didn't really get into what we think of as the Wild West until he was discovered by a journalist who went by the name of Ned Buntline. And that wasn't Ned's real name. That was sort of his pen name. And at the time, he was probably the highest paid writer, supposedly, in the United States. And he had a pretty exciting life, too. His real name was Edward Zane Carroll, this journalist. And he was, I think, to put it mildly, he was a chronic liar. He had a limp that he would walk around with, and people would ask him how he got his limp, and he would say that he received it by getting shot during some conflict or war, but that was a lie. Ned Buntline actually received the limp while hurting his leg when he was jumping out of a window, trying to escape a group of people who wanted to lynch him for shooting a man who accused him of sleeping with his wife, which he had. He was then lynched to an awning, and a passerby took pity on him and cut him down. And so that all really happened to him. But that's not the story that he told. His story was much more chivalrous and exciting and heroic. So he went west looking to find great stories to tell the Eastern audience about the Wild West, the dwindling West, because there was a real hunger for that type of fiction and true stories. And so he went west and he found William Cody. And like I said, Cody definitely had a very exciting life, and there was a lot that he took part in that could be considered pretty wild. And the two hit it off, and they traveled together for a time. And Ned Buntline raced back east and wrote his big famous story about Buffalo Bill. It was something like King of the Bordermen, the truest and wildest tale I've ever told. And predictably for Ned Buntline, it was all full of lies and tall tales. And that really kind of began, in my opinion, the Wild West. Ned Buntline's story was such a popular hit back east that he went back to Buffalo Bill and he was like, hey, what do you think about coming back east with me and sort of presenting these plays, to Eastern audiences of your adventures? And he agreed to do it sort of in his off season when he wasn't working as a scout for the U.S. Army. And these plays were notoriously badly acted and just atrocious, and the audiences loved them. They just couldn't get enough of Buffalo Bill and people like him. And so that eventually evolved into Wild Bill's Wild West show. And the Wild West show is interesting because he felt he wanted to present the people seeing the show something that he thought was a real slice of the West. He didn't want a circus. It wasn't elephants and giraffes. He wanted to give people an authentic sort of experience, something that really felt and seemed like to him what was a piece of the vanishing frontier. Because by this point, the late 1880s, it was vanishing. And so he went around and he found people who really sort of embraced and idealized what he thought of as the Wild West. There was Native Americans, there were trick shooters, there were cowboys, there were all the folks that you think of when you think of the Wild West. And he brought them around the United States by train and around the world. And there's a reason why, if you go to Europe and you talk to them about Native Americans, they think of the Plains Indians, because that was who Buffalo Bill had brought with him. He brought with him a lot of the Sioux and other Plains Indian tribes that sort of made up his experience of the West. So it really, his show has really sort of cemented in our sort of shared imaginations what the West was. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because some of it was probably exaggerated a bit, but other parts were very realistic. During my research for the book, I got the chance to interview some folks with the Denver March Powwow, and sort of said, hey, Buffalo Bill Cody features very prominently kind of in the history of how Native Americans are presented, to the world. What do you think of him? What kind of guy was he? How did you look at him? And apparently they look at him favorably, because he fairly paid the workers that went with him, and the performers and the Native Americans, and that wasn't always the case. And he also treated his animals well, which also wasn't the case at the time. So it's interesting that you get somebody like Buffalo Bill, and he kind of really made the term Wild West popular. In his own time. I don't know if you can see this or not. This is a dime novel starring Buffalo Bill. And so he was kind of like a comic book character in his own time, which is sort of interesting. So I think in a lot of respects, that kind of began the journey for me to try to find out who he was. Who was Buffalo Bill Cody?